This lecture will focus on the breakdowns within the Republican Party and the kind of quick end to Reconstruction that happens because of it. Our 18th president, Ulysses S Grant, was a great general, but really was not very experienced in politics. I think his heart was in the right place. He wanted to do the right things, especially when it came to Reconstruction. He wanted to push that forward, but he had some weaknesses. His weaknesses were, he had very little political experience, so he didn't really know how the game was played. He didn't really know what was supposed to be happening, and what his role is and everything like that. And the second thing was kind of his belief about his role. What he believed is he, as the president, was there to carry out laws. As an executive branch, they're supposed to enforce the laws. So he thought, all I have to do is enforce the laws and make sure that they happen, and I'm not going to try and steer legislation or anything like that. I'm just going to leave the making of the laws up to Congress, and then whatever they say, I will just enforce it. And really, this didn't work out. The president needs to have a more active hand in creating the laws so that they can be a little more on board with the laws that they are enforcing. And so some of these shortcomings caused a split in the Republican Party under Grant, and also a kind of an undermining of the ideas of Reconstruction, and Reconstruction became less and less popular until eventually it will go away. So, under Grant's first term, the Republicans were still in charge in Congress, and so everything went fairly smoothly, but it kind of laid the groundwork for the Democrats and some Republicans to not like what he's doing. What happened there is Grant was enforcing Reconstruction. So Reconstruction was still going on. The Republicans were still making the laws, and Grant was enforcing it as he was told to. Also, they continued and maintained the high tariffs. So remember, that protects your own industry, makes things a little bit more expensive coming from other countries, taxing those other countries. Third, there were very strict bank regulations that did not necessarily allow them to borrow out money to just anybody. Really, you need to have a pretty good record to get a loan at this point, and continued more federal spending on infrastructure like bridges and railroads and things like that. Not only that, but there were some things called sin taxes. Sin taxes are federal taxes on things that are bad, right? Bad for you, but you pay a little bit to be able to do them, such as alcohol and tobacco. People have talked about sin taxes on things like fast food and stuff like that, right? So something we know is bad for us, and if you're going to do it, you got to pay an extra tax to the government. So it kind of incentivizes you not to do it, is the idea. But really, what the whole point of this was to make money during the war, so that they could have that money, and he kept those taxes in place. And so the Democrats said that under Grant's administration, the wealthy, the rich people had way too much influence on that administration, and all of the things were favoring the rich people. If you look at all of these things up here, they favor the business owners, the rich people that are, at this point, they felt in charge of what the country was doing and the direction that it was going during Grant's first term. The election of 1872 kind of showed this splitting of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party split because they were not happy with Grant, and they didn't like how much it was helping and benefiting the rich. And so a group of Republicans known as the Liberal Republicans split off, and during their nomination, the Republican Party nomination, they tried to block Grant and get somebody else put in there. And when they could not do that, when they couldn't block Grant's nomination, they switched over and nominated their own candidate for president, publisher by the name of Horace Greeley. We got a picture of him right up here. And they were trying to get this man elected for president. So they tried their best to get some popularity going on in the South. And so they promised that they would pardon pretty much every Confederate and remove troops from the South if Horace Greeley was made president. And so Realizing that Grant was the most popular option and would almost certainly win, the Democrats decided they would also nominate Greeley and go with him and stand behind him. And so now it was the liberal Republicans and the Democrats nominating Greeley because they knew that Grant, the war hero, was very popular, and it would be very difficult to beat him. And that ended up being true in the election of 1872. Ulysses S. Grant was elected again and easily won that re-election. Take a moment to write out the answer to checkpoint question number 1. And in Ulysses S. Grant's second term is when things really started to go bad. There was a wave of scandals that happened that really hurt the vision of his administration. The Secretary of War, William Belknap, he was forced to resign after accepting bribes from Western military camps to try and get more supplies, get better troops, get whatever. Okay, and so he was forced to resign because he was accepting bribes. And then also on Grant's watch, the whiskey ring scandal happened, and that happened in St. Louis, Missouri. A bunch of government officials and distillers, whiskey distillers, people that make whiskey, had made these false tax reports. And so they had cheated the government out of millions of dollars. And it's reported that maybe Grant's private secretary was involved in this. Now, this was never proven that he did that, okay, but it was still a black mark on his reputation, okay. And then also on top of that, the Panic of 1873 happened, where a really powerful banking company called J. Cook and Company made some bad investments and had to declare bankruptcy. But what this caused is a bunch of people to have fear that the bank system was going to shut down. And so that fear caused runs on the banks, which caused small banks to close. It caused the stock market to go down really quickly. It caused a lot of businesses to close, which made unemployment go way up. So people had less money, less access to money. The stocks were down and you couldn't get a job. And so with all of this negativity happening in the midterm elections, 1874, 2 years into this term, the Democrats were starting to gain popularity, and they took the House of Representatives from the Republicans and were able to gain in the Senate, okay, pushing this more back towards a democratic country, and more in favor of the ideals of the South and not this strict Reconstruction. In the South, the Democrats started to win back the power. And the way that they won back the power was both illegally and legally. Some of the illegal things that they did was stuffing the ballot box, so adding extra votes, as well as stealing ballot boxes from Republican counties and getting rid of all of those Republican votes. And so those are kind of the illegal things, as well as obviously the Ku Klux Klan was continuing to terrorize people and try and get them not to vote. But also they kind of really appealed to kind of the racism that was happening in the South. And they said that the Democrats needed to redeem the South from black Republican rule. You can see kind of the racist ads that were happening here. Okay, the Democratic platform is for the white man and the Republican platform is for the Negro. And it shows this caricaturized version of black person. Okay, and so this voting based on race got a lot of those small farmers to switch back to being a Democrat because they didn't want to vote for the black side. They wanted to vote for themselves. And so since it became a racial thing, it was less voting on what was best for you and more voting on your own skin color. And by 1876, all but 3 states of the South went back to the Democrats. These states were Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. Those 3 states had really large African American, a large amount of African American voters, and they were protected in these big cities by Union troops. And so, where it was fair, those people continued to win. The Republicans continued to win. So the Compromise of 1877 came later with that next election. And so the election happened, and the Republicans did not want Grant back as the president, and so they didn't run him again. Instead, they selected Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a governor of Ohio. A lot of people saw him as a moral man, a good man, who wasn't one of the people that was dealing with any scandal or corruption. He also wanted to end radical Reconstruction. And the Democrats instead brought out Samuel Tilden. Samuel Tilden was a rich banker, okay, a rich corporate lawyer, and he was the governor of New York at one point. He was trying to end that corruption in New York City's government, so he was also trying to end or work against corruption. Both of these people were seen as moral men fighting against the corruption here. Okay, and so after all of this happened and the votes came in, 165 electoral votes were obviously voted for Hayes, 184 were obviously voted for Tilden, but there were 20 disputed votes that we weren't sure who it was, and most of those were in the Republican-controlled areas of Louisiana, South Carolina, and Florida. There was only one in Oregon who or that wasn't necessarily a strong Republican area. And so these 20 disputed votes came down, and there had been so much cheating and election fraud in this election that nobody had any idea who actually had won, and everybody kind of realized it wasn't fair. And so a committee got together of 8 Republicans and 7 Democrats, and they had to decide who to give the votes to. Well, all the Republicans voted to give the votes to Hayes. All the Democrats voted to give the votes to Tilden. And so Hayes won all of the votes because there was one more Republican than Democrat in that committee. All right. Now, Congress easily could have shut this down and said, nope, we're not accepting this. Would have gone back and we would have had to decide what to do with it there. But a lot of people believe that there was a deal made, and this deal is referred to as the Compromise of 1877. And this deal was the Republicans promised that if they allowed Hayes to be elected and be the next president, then they would pull the troops out of the South and end Reconstruction. And so they said they accepted Hayes as the president, and Reconstruction ended. In April 1877, the troops were pulled out, and the last Republican governments of the South in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina collapsed and went back to the Democrats. Take a moment to write out your answer to checkpoint number 2. A lot of the leaders in the South were asking for a new South. This was a phrase that was made by an editor of the Atlanta Constitution, a newspaper. And really what it meant was to build a new type of economy in the South, like the North, that had industry, that had factories, that had all of the things that you would need to be a modern economy that didn't just rely on farming. And a lot of powerful people, white Southerners, along with some Northern money, made a lot of economic changes to the South. By 1890, there were thousands of miles of railroad track all across the South. Starting in Birmingham, Alabama, there was strong iron and steel industry that was developed there, as well as, the continuation of growing tobacco and cotton. But now in the South, tobacco processing plants and cotton mills were built, and so they could use that raw material and create it into something sellable. So they would have the farm and the factory instead of shipping the raw goods off to somewhere else for someone else to make money off of those goods. Now, that was true. It started to build a little bit, but even with this industrial growth, most of the people in the South continued to farm. That's what they continued to do. Only a small percent of the people that worked in manufacturing in the South. So African Americans had kind of a hard time after Reconstruction because it ended too quickly before they were able to catch up, right? And so they had hopes of being given land that was promised to them by William Tecumseh Sherman, right? 40 acres and a mule, reparations, all right? The hopes of getting that had kind of died out. And so they had to get to work, and they didn't have any land of their own to work on. So many of them became tenant farmers. A tenant farmer is a farmer who works the land that is owned by another person, and you pay rent to that person in either money or in a portion of your crops. Okay, and eventually that tenant farming, if you could pay in money and all that kind of stuff, would eventually turn into sharecroppers. Okay, and sharecroppers was even kind of a worse version of it, where you would be a farmer and you would work the land for an owner who provided everything to you. So they would sell you the seeds, they would sell you the tools or rent you the tools, they would rent you the house, okay, all that kind of stuff. And before that, they would get a share of the crop, and their share of the crop would be huge, as much as 50 to 66%. So half to 2/3 of your crop would go to that owner. And then if they needed more seeds or more tools or whatever, they could get it on credit from the stores, and the stores were most likely owned by the landowner, right? By the person who owned their land that they had to pay, and they would buy that on credit. And on that credit, because these African Americans didn't have much money to put up as credit, they would use crop liens. So if you couldn't pay your debts, you had to give up part of your crop, part of what you were growing, to pay it. Okay, and so this set up this system, which I have a diagram up here of it, of debt peonage. Okay, and debt peonage, it essentially is, you're a sharecropper, but you're not able to pay off all of your debts. And so you couldn't leave the property that you worked on, because you had to say, okay, I'll work next year and I'll give you more of my percentage to make up for last year when I wasn't able to pay everything that I owed. So you can kind of see it up here. It starts off with the sharecropper. He gets his land and seed, and he promises the landowner half of the crop, right? And then it goes on to number 2. He buys food and clothes on credit from the landowner's store. So I'll pay you back later, right? He plants, he harvests a crop, he does all of the work, okay? And then the sharecropper gives the landowner crops to sell, and the sharecropper gets half of the earnings minus his debt for the year, right? So he gets half of the money, but it also all of a sudden takes away all that he spent on food, clothing, all that kind of stuff, right? And then number 5 comes in, and when they settle up, the landowner says, oh, you owe me more than you actually earned. You have negative money. And so in order to pay that debt, that negative money, the sharecropper would promise the landowner a bigger share of the next year's crop. And then it would go back to number 1, where now instead of half, it's 2/3 of the crop. And then it keeps going in this cycle where they can't get out of debt, and they just get further and further behind, putting them in the system where they're basically working for free and just getting clothes and food to survive, just like when they were a slave. And so it didn't really, this was not a good system that got these people out of this situation that they had been in before. Take a moment to write out 3 questions that you have from the notes so far. If you don't have any questions, just write 3 questions you might see on a quiz or a test from this material.